The stagecoach rattled through the black pine woods, its wheels catching on the broken stones of the mountain road. In the corner of the carriage, huddled in a gray wool dress that strained at the seams, sat Alina Hart. Her gloved hands clutched a battered valise, the stitching worn thin from years of wishing. Every rut in the road sent her heavier frame shifting in the seat, a subtle reminder of the letter in her pocket, the one she had clung to like a promise stitched in gold. "Come to Mercy Ridge," it had said. "I seek a wife sturdy of heart and strong in constitution." Signed, Jonathan Price, lumberman. She had imagined it a kindness. A man who knew his life demanded more than some delicate society wife with paper wrists. A man who would see her not as burden, but as blessing. As the woods thickened and the air turned cold with November's teeth, Elinor told herself to hold on to hope a little longer. She had no family left to speak of, and the last town she'd lived in had offered nothing but sidelong glances and hushed cruelty. Here, she might find a place where her size was not a curse, but a proof of good stock, good work. She smoothed the front of her dress, the thick cloth pulling taut across her stomach, and stared out the window into the gathering dusk. Mercy Ridge rose up mean from the wilderness, a scatter of log buildings clinging to the side of the mountain like a man clinging to a crumbling ledge. Smoke from a dozen chimneys smeared the sky. When the stage ground to a halt, she was the only one to step off, boots crunching into the frosted mud. Waiting by the livery stable was Jonathan Price. He was younger than she dared hope, built thick as the pines around him, with a beard to his chest and an axe slung over his shoulder like a badge of office. For a heartbeat, Elinor thought the world might finally be giving her something back. She smiled, careful, shy. Jonathan Price's eyes flicked over her body, the broadness of her shoulders, the generous swell of her hips, the heavy lines of her arms beneath the wool, and his face hardened. His hand tightened on the axe handle. "You," he said, the word edged like a knife. Elinor faltered. "Yes," she managed. "I'm Elinor Hart. We exchanged letters." Jonathan shook his head. "I said strong, I didn't say that." Around them, the townsfolk had begun to take notice. A pair of skinny boys snickered behind cupped hands. A woman with a basket of kindling turned away too quickly. Elinor felt the heat rise in her face, a heat that had nothing to do with the cold. "I'm sorry you were misled," Jonathan said, his voice tight. "I ain't in need of someone who'll eat more than she can carry." The words struck with more weight than a fist. The stagecoach driver, an old man with rheumy eyes, cleared his throat. "Miss," he said, "you want back aboard." It would have been easy to climb back into the stage. Easy to retreat, as she had retreated so many times before, dragging her shame behind her like a tattered train. But something inside Elinor had grown hard and sharp on the long journey west. "No," she said, voice steady. "I came here to build a life. I intend to do so." Jonathan muttered something under his breath and turned away. The townsfolk drifted back to their chores, their laughter lingering behind them like smoke. The driver tipped his hat in a half apology and rumbled off, the coach wheels vanishing into the dark woods. Elinor stood alone with her valise in the dirt of Mercy Ridge. It was then she noticed the other man standing in the shadows of the stable. He was taller even than Jonathan, leaner but broad-shouldered, his hair dark as crow feathers and tied at the nape of his neck. His clothes were worn but neat, and when he looked at her, there was no mockery in his eyes. Only a deep, patient study, like a man weighing something valuable he didn't yet understand. He stepped forward, the crunch of his boots deliberate, sure. "You'll need a place to stay," he said. His voice was low, a little rough at the edges, like a saw blade worn to smoothness. Elinor swallowed. "I will. My cabin's out past Widow's Hollow. Plenty of room. I don't take charity cases," he added, almost gruff. "You'll work your keep." Relief threatened to unmake her right there in the mud, but Elinor straightened her spine. "I can work," she said. "I'm not afraid of it." The man nodded once, as if that were all the answer he required. He lifted her valise easily in one hand and motioned for her to follow. As Elinor stumbled after him into the cold arms of the trees, she felt something raw and unnameable settle in her chest. Not hope, not yet. But a beginning, a kindling waiting for the strike of flint. The town of Mercy Ridge had made it clear she was not wanted. Elinor Hart intended to make herself necessary. And the woodsman, whether he knew it or not, had just taken the first step toward a life he would not be able to walk away from. The path to Widow's Hollow twisted through a forest so thick it swallowed the moonlight. Roots snagged at Alina's boots, and cold mist coiled around her skirts. The woodsman moved ahead without lantern or hesitation, his broad back a dark shape against the deeper dark. He had told her his name as they left town, Elias Cutter. It suited him, she thought. There was something precise about the way he moved, as if he knew how to carve space from a world that gave nothing freely. By the time they reached his cabin, Alina's legs ached and her breath steamed the air in ragged puffs. The cabin sat in a clearing ringed with birch and black oak, its chimney a broken tooth against the sky. A thin line of smoke drifted from it, promising warmth but no luxury. Inside, the place was bare as a bone. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot against one wall, a fireplace guttering with low flames. No ornaments, no curtains, no softness. It was a place built for survival, not comfort. Elias set her valise down, without ceremony. "You'll sleep by the hearth," he said. "There's a pallet and some wool blankets. I expect you up at dawn." Alina nodded. She would have nodded to anything just then, just to be out of the wind, just to sit without fear of judgment. She knelt by the fire, feeding it small bits of wood from the box nearby, coaxing the embers back to life. Elias watched her for a moment, then grunted and went outside without another word. Left alone, Alina unpacked the few things she had: 2 more dresses, worn through at the elbows, a Bible with pages so thin they tore like moth wings, and a small tin box that contained her mother's wedding ring and a scrap of faded lace. She folded her belongings carefully, placing them on the floor near her pallet. The quiet of the woods pressed against the walls, vast and unforgiving. In the distance, an owl called once, mournful and hollow. Alina sat on the pallet, the rough wool itching through her skirts, and stared into the fire until her eyelids grew heavy. She did not cry. Tears were a waste she could no longer afford. When Elias came back in, smelling of cold air and pine sap, he said nothing. He just bolted the door, hung his axe on the wall, and dropped onto his cot with the heavy finality of a man who trusted no one but himself. The fire crackled between them, throwing long shadows against the walls. Alina watched him for a moment before she lay down, pulling the wool up to her chin. Sleep found her slowly, creeping in like a thief. The next morning, before the sun had even burned the mist from the trees, Elias roused her with a sharp word and a hard look. There was no easing into the day. He handed her a pair of old leather gloves and pointed toward a stack of split logs by the shed. "Stack them by the cabin. Need dry wood inside before the snows come." Alina pulled on the gloves and set to work, muscles protesting with every haul and lift. The cold bit through her dress, and sweat prickled along her spine. Elias worked nearby, repairing the roof with quick, brutal efficiency. He did not offer help, did not ask if she was managing. She did not expect him to. By midday, her arms shook from exertion, but the neat pile of wood stood twice as tall as it had when she began. Elias came down from the roof and surveyed her work with a flat, unreadable gaze. "Good," he said finally, one word, no more. But it landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of something Alina dared not name through her chest. The days fell into rhythm after that. Chores without end, gathering kindling, patching the fence, hauling water from the half-frozen creek. Elias taught her how to set traps for rabbits, how to gut a fish with swift, clean strokes. He did not speak unless necessary, but when he did, his words were measured and precise, as if each one cost him something. Alina learned to read the weather in the tilt of the clouds, the way the crows flew low over the trees. She learned to move through the woods without thrashing, to listen for the quiet language of danger. She hardened, she lost weight she had carried for years, but the work did not sculpt her into something dainty. It made her broader, stronger, carved from the same stubborn stone as the land itself. In town, word of her still drifted like smoke. She heard it when she went into trade for flour or kerosene. The women eyed her with thin smiles. The men chuckled into their beards. The girl too big for the lumberman, the stray taken in by a half-wild woodsman. Alina met their looks without flinching. She had learned not to bend under the weight of other people's judgment. Elias said nothing about the gossip. If he heard it, he did not show it. But sometimes, in the evenings, when the fire burned low and Alina's hands were raw from work, she caught him looking at her. Not in the way Jonathan Price had, with contempt or pity, but as if he was trying to figure something out about her that didn't fit into the world he knew. One night, as snow hissed against the cabin walls and the wind keened like a wounded thing, Elias spoke into the thick silence between them. "You ever think about leaving?" Alina turned from the fire, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I came here to stay," she said, "no matter who thinks I shouldn't." Elias nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he had only suspected. Outside, the storm battered the trees, but inside the cabin, a different kind of storm was gathering. One that neither of them fully understood yet. One that would change everything. Winter came down hard on Mercy Ridge. The snow lay deep enough to swallow a man to the knees, and the trees cracked under the weight of ice. At night, the cold was a living thing, slipping through the cabin's seams, gnawing at fingers and toes. Alina adapted. She stitched patches onto her skirts and lined her boots with rabbit fur. She learned to swing an axe with enough strength to split thick logs, her breath rising in great clouds in the frigid air. Elias watched her, silently, as she grew into the work, as she met the bitter cold with a steady ferocity that few in town could match. He spoke more now, though still sparingly, a nod here, a rough word of approval there. He began teaching her finer things, how to sharpen a blade to a razor's edge, how to find the sweet water under frozen earth. They worked side by side through the heart of winter, their lives braided together by the simple, brutal needs of survival. One afternoon, while checking trap lines beyond the ridge, Alina heard the crack before she felt the pain. A hidden pit dug by a hunter and long abandoned had collapsed under her weight. She fell hard, striking her ankle against a buried rock. The agony was blinding, white-hot, and immediate. Elias was at her side before she could even cry out, his face carved in sharp lines of worry. He crouched beside the hole, reaching down with both arms. "Grab hold," he said, voice harsh with urgency. Alina gritted her teeth and hauled herself up, the injured ankle screaming in protest. Elias lifted her free with a force that seemed effortless, cradling her against his chest as he carried her back through the snow. She should have felt shame, helplessness. But she only felt the steady thud of his heart against her ear, the way his arms tightened protectively around her. Back at the cabin, he set her down by the fire with a gentleness she would never have expected from him. He tore strips from a clean shirt to bind her ankle, his rough hands surprisingly careful. "You're lucky it ain't broken clean through," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. "Sprain'll heal, you just stay off it." Alina nodded, the pain making her dizzy. She closed her eyes, listening to the sound of Elias moving around the cabin, tending the fire, fetching water, doing what needed doing without complaint. For days, she was trapped on her pallet, helpless to do more than mend clothes or prepare simple meals from her seated position. Elias took on the extra labor without a word. He cooked, badly but determinedly, and returned from the woods each evening with meat slung over his shoulder and snow clinging to his beard. He never said she owed him, never hinted that she was a burden. In that silence, something powerful grew. Not the desperate hope she had once felt when she stepped off the stagecoach, but something rooted deeper. Something that had survived ridicule and rejection, that had been honed by hardship and loneliness. Respect, trust, maybe even the fragile beginnings of love. But love, Alina knew, was a dangerous thing. It could be mistaken, misused, betrayed. So she kept it buried, a secret wound she would not expose to the open air. Her ankle healed slowly, and by the time spring broke through the frozen crust of the land, she was strong enough to walk again. Limping at first, then steadily stronger. The thaw brought new dangers. With the river swelling from snowmelt, floods swept away the lower bridges. Hunger drove bears down from the high country, desperate and bold. And in Mercy Ridge, trouble brewed among men who had spent the winter drinking and festering in their own bitterness. It came to a head one night when Alina rode into town with Elias for supplies. Jonathan Price was waiting outside the general store, drunk and sour-faced. He staggered forward as they approached, the stink of whiskey heavy on his breath. His friends, a few other lumbermen, all loose-limbed and mean-eyed, laughed from the shadows. "Look what the tide dragged in," Jonathan sneered. His eyes slid over Alina with vicious delight. "Found yourself a charity case, Cutter. Couldn't find a woman worth the trouble, so you picked up the town's leftovers." Elias stiffened, his hand hovering near the knife at his belt. Alina laid a hand on his arm before he could move. "Not worth it," she said, voice low and sure. "He's already smaller than me, no need to make him feel it more." The words cut sharper than any blade. Jonathan flushed a deep, ugly red. "You think you're something now," he spat. "Just a fat sow dressing herself up like a lady. You're nothing, always been nothing." The crowd of loiterers muttered, eager for blood. Elias stepped between Alina and Jonathan, a wall of silent fury. "You best walk away," Elias said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a falling tree. Jonathan hesitated, swayed by drink and anger, but some sliver of animal instinct made him back down. He spit into the dirt, muttered something foul, and staggered off into the night. The others drifted after him, their courage leaking away with his departure. Elias turned to Alina, his eyes searching hers, something raw and fierce flickering in their depths. "You don't listen to their poison," he said. "You hear me, you ain't what they say." Alina felt the truth of it strike deep, a blow more potent than any insult. She nodded, not trusting her voice. They left the town behind, the path home lit only by starlight, and the slow, certain beat of something dangerous and sacred growing between them. Something that neither cruelty nor cold could touch. Spring brought life back to Mercy Ridge, but it brought other things too. Men poured into the woods, prospectors, drifters, thieves in all but name, drawn by rumors of gold veins hidden deep in the mountains. They had no loyalty to the town, no stake in its survival. They took what they wanted and left what they ruined. The sheriff, old and slow from too many seasons spent behind a desk, could not keep order. Fights broke out at the saloon, women disappeared. Livestock was found butchered, half of it wasted for sport. Elias began keeping a rifle propped beside the door at all times. He and Alina worked their land harder than ever, planting crops, repairing the barn, trapping extra meat. Neither said it aloud, but they both knew, if trouble came, it would come to the ones who lived outside the town first. Late one afternoon, Alina was gutting a rabbit on the chopping block when the first sign appeared. Drags. Boot prints deep and careless, circling the cabin in the muddy earth. Not Elias, not hers. She wiped her bloody hands on her apron and followed the trail into the trees, heart pounding a steady drumbeat against her ribs. A glint of metal caught her eye. A snare had been set near the creek, not the kind Elias taught her to set, but crude, cruel, meant for something larger than rabbits. A message, a warning. She went back to the cabin and waited, the fire stoked high, Elias' rifle within reach. When he returned from setting traps up the ridge, she told him what she had found. He listened without speaking, his jaw clenched tight enough to turn the bone white beneath his beard. That night they slept lightly, fully clothed, ears straining for the snap of a twig, the creak of a step. It came just past midnight. A low scrape against the door, a breath of air shifting through the cracks. Elias was up in an instant, rifle leveled, body tense. Alina grabbed the hunting knife from the table and moved to cover the back window. The door shuddered as something heavy slammed against it. "Come out, Cutter," a voice slurred from outside. "We just want to talk." Laughter followed, ugly, mean-spirited. Elias didn't waste breath on warnings. He fired a shot into the roof of the porch, splintering wood. A howl of rage answered, then the sound of retreating footsteps crashing through the underbrush. They did not sleep again that night. By morning, the air was thick with the knowledge that it would not be the last time. They fortified the cabin as best they could, boarding the windows, stacking wood and stones to make barricades. Alina sharpened every blade in the house until her hands were raw and nicked. Elias worked without pause, but when dusk fell, He stood in the doorway and looked at her in a way he never had before. "You could still go," he said. "Head east, find a town that's safer." Elena straightened, the weight of her own survival settled deep in her bones. "I didn't come here to run," she said, "and I'm not leaving you to fight alone." The words broke something loose in him, something he had held locked behind duty and caution. He crossed the room in 2 strides, cupping her face in his rough hands. His thumb brushed the corner of her mouth, hesitant, reverent. "You're not what I expected," he said, voice low and thick. "You're more." Elena set her hand over his heart, feeling the thunder of it beneath his ribs. "So are you," she said. The kiss, when it came, was not tender. It was raw, desperate, a claiming forged from fear and fury and need. Afterward they sat by the fire, bodies pressed together, weapons within reach. Waiting. Because Mercy Ridge was a place that chewed up the weak, and love here was not a gentle thing. It was survival. It was choosing, again and again, to stand and fight when everything in the world told you to flee. When the next attack came, it would not find them alone. It would find them ready. It would find them unwilling to be moved. The storm broke 2 nights later. Elena woke to the sound of a rock crashing through the cabin window, the wind howling in after it like a wounded beast. Elias was already moving, rifle in hand, boots pounding the dirt floor. Shadows shifted outside, men, 3, maybe 4, armed with knives, clubs, whatever they could scavenge. Their breath smoked in the freezing air, curses and laughter twisting into the night. "Stay low," Elias barked, voice cutting through the chaos. Elena grabbed the shotgun from beneath the cot and rolled toward the hearth, keeping herself between the firelight and the broken window. Another rock flew in, striking the far wall. Splinters of wood and glass rained down. "Come out, Cutter," a voice jeered, "or we'll drag that fatso out ourselves." A red rage boiled up in Elena, hotter than fear. She met Elias' gaze across the room, no hesitation, no retreat. Elias opened the door just wide enough to fire. The blast of the rifle cracked the air, and a scream followed, high and shocked. The attackers surged forward in answer. One of them barreled through the doorway, a filthy bandana over his face, a knife flashing in his hand. Elena fired from the hip. The shotgun roared and the man crumpled, knocked backward into the snow. Another came at her from the side, young, wild-eyed, carrying a rusted hatchet. Elena drove the butt of the shotgun into his gut with all her strength. He folded over with a wet grunt, and she kicked him hard enough to send him sprawling into the firewood pile. Outside, someone screamed for retreat, but another voice shouted to press on. Elias stepped out onto the porch, fearless and brutal, his rifle swinging like an extension of his will. He fired once, twice. Another body hit the ground, writhing and moaning. The last 2 turned and fled into the woods, their courage spent. Silence fell, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the wounded groans fading into the distance. Elena sat down hard on the floor, her hands trembling around the shotgun. Blood smeared her apron, some of it hers where glass had sliced her forearm, most of it not. Elias closed the door, bolting it with deliberate slowness. He set the rifle aside and crouched beside her, his hand finding hers, squeezing once, firm and steady. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, breath coming in ragged pulls. "You," she rasped. He gave a ghost of a smile, had worse. They set to work without needing to speak further. They dragged the dead men into the woods and buried them shallow, marking the graves with nothing but stones. In Mercy Ridge, there were no questions for men who came to steal and kill and found the wrong prey instead. By dawn, the cabin was patched as best it could be, the blood scrubbed from the floor, the weapons cleaned and reloaded. Elena stood in the doorway, staring out at the mist rising from the ground, the first fragile green of spring stirring beneath the snow. Elias came to stand beside her, his presence solid and certain. "You sure you want this?" he asked, voice low. "This life with me?" She turned to him, the rising sun lighting his face in hard gold. "I chose it," she said. "I choose it still." He took her hand in his, rough fingers entwining with hers. No grand promises, No soft speeches. Only the hard, quiet truth of two people who had survived the worst the world could throw at them and found something worth keeping. Together, they stepped forward into the day. Not as the outcast and the stray, but as something stronger. Something built to endure. And behind them, Mercy Ridge whispered and shifted, the town's small-minded cruelty already losing its grip on them. They had carved a place for themselves out of stone and blood and stubborn hope. It would not be taken from them. Not now. Not ever.